our next speaker is Justin Walsh. He is now newly professor, congratulations on the promotion, of art history and archaeology at Chapman University, which coincidentally is right near where I grew up. He has almost 25 years of archaeological experience in Spain, Jordan, Italy, the US, and now low Earth orbit. In Mediterranean archaeology, he specializes in intercultural exchange, and he is a global leader in the field of space archaeology and heritage, which is a relatively new field. And he's directed the International Space Station Archaeological Project since 2015. And he's also won numerous grants and awards. He's a Fulbright Scholar. He's won a Rome Prize and has received a National Geographic Explorer grant. And more recently, he and his team won the Archaeological Institute of America's 2023 Award for Outstanding Work in Digital Archaeology. And he is also this year the Ad Astra Distinguished Fellow in Space Anthropology, yay, and Space Habitats at the Space Engineering Research Center at the University of Southern California. So thank you so much for joining us today. I will be taking questions in the chat, and if you have questions along the way, you can definitely send them to me, Dina Weibel, and I will turn it over to you, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. You can hear me okay? Dina,
yes.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, perfect.
Yep,
all right.
We can hear you.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to Dina for the invitation to come to talk to you virtually. I'm here in a hotel room in Chicago because I was giving a lecture here last night, and there's a little construction going on next door to me, but hopefully you won't be able to hear that. So today I'm here to talk to you about the International Space Station Archaeological Project, which I've been collaborating with my Australian colleague Alice Gorman on since late 2015. I'll be telling you all about that story and some of the things that we've achieved in that period of time. So first of all, you're probably just wondering, what is space archaeology? And actually, even before I talk about that, I probably even need to take a further step back and talk about what archaeology really is, because I think that most people have a sense of it as being associated strictly with the distant past. And it's true. Most of the time, archaeologists do work on things that are very, very old. For example, I have another excavation in the south of Spain where I'm working on Roman and pre-Roman material that dates back 2,500, 2,800 years ago. However, what archaeology really is a study of certain kinds of evidence called material culture, primarily, which means objects and built spaces, architecture, and human associations with those objects and built spaces that allow us to understand how people adapt to their environment, how they relate to one another, how they behave, etc. And if that's our perspective on what archaeology is, then in fact, any time period and any place is really wide open for our study. So in the case of space archaeology, we're looking at particularly the study of material culture associated with human activity in space, or with human activity on Earth that is directed at space. Now, I realize that it's possible you may have heard the term space archaeology also be used for the use of satellite-based imaging technology of sites on Earth, archaeological sites on Earth, in order to identify them or to document them. Most space archaeologists do not use the term that way. Instead, we're talking really about what people are doing in space as the subject of our study. And what you're looking at here is a very early example of space archaeology. Obviously, Sputnik was the first thing we put into space in 1957. Here we're looking at an American example of a Vanguard satellite, one that did not make it into orbit, and therefore kind of was recovered in this broken state and was accessioned by the National Air and Space Museum, and that's where it's located now. But I'm showing you this object not because it didn't make it into space, but because it represents the item in space that has been there the longest and that is still there, which is the Vanguard 1 satellite. So that is still orbiting Earth, and we can track it, and we know its location, and that would be the oldest piece of human material culture in space. When we think about places that we could go and investigate as archaeological sites, certainly the first one that pops out in my mind would be Tranquility Base. So the first place where humans set foot on anything that wasn't the Earth. And so we have a nice image on the left of the lunar module with one of the two crew members working on it. And on the right, we actually have a map of the site that was created by an archaeologist, a colleague named Beth O'Leary, who recently retired from New Mexico State University. She was really the first person to treat a site of human activity in space as an archaeological site. And her interest in that study, which happened between 1999 and 2002, and which is called the Lunar Legacy Project, which you can certainly look up online. Its website is still active. This project was primarily interested in the site for its heritage qualities. That is to say, what exists at the site that might need to be preserved for the future. And so what she had to do first was identify what had been left behind by the crew of Apollo 11, because in fact, although there were definitely things that were always intended to be left behind, like the lower half of the lunar module, and like the flag and certain experiments, etc., there were also, as it turned out, quite a lot of other items. A total of 106 items actually were left behind, according to her study. And what had happened was that with just a few minutes left before takeoff, and nobody ever having tried to take off of the moon before, there was concern about the weight of the lunar module, especially with all the hundreds of pounds of rock samples that had been brought on board. And so Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were told, hey, take everything you don't need anymore and throw it out the door. And that's what they did. They created what, this is very archaeological terminology, what O'Leary has referred to as a toss zone. That is to say, an area of discard outside the foot of the lunar module. So if we were to go back there, in this area is where we would likely find things like boot covers and parts of the EVA suits, and also urine bags, fecal collection bags, those kinds of things that were purposely left behind at the end of the mission. There are cultural items, I mean, really explicitly and obviously cultural items that have been left behind on the moon as well. So for example, here we're looking at a family photo that was left behind by Charlie Duke, taken in his backyard in Houston, in a small plastic bag. He left that behind during the Apollo 16 mission. And here we're looking at a memorial that consists of a small titanium abstract sculpture of a human, and a card, a printed card with the names of everybody, astronauts and cosmonauts, who are known as of the Apollo 15 mission to have died in pursuing space flight. And so what we have here in essence is a memorial to the deceased called Fallen Astronaut. So that exists on the moon as well. We can look to other places besides the moon for evidence of archaeological material and for evidence of human activity. So here's what I like to call the Mars 2020 archaeological landscape on the left. This is Jezero crater, created by the landing of the Perseverance rover and associated material. So here's Perseverance itself, whereas during the landing process, the parachute and back shell ended up over here, the descent stage or sky crane over here, and the heat shield over here. So all of this is evidence for human activity via what we can kind of call our robotic avatars. And not only do we have this satellite imagery of this landscape, but you may be aware that in April of last year, the rover Perseverance discovered the site of the impact of the back shell and parachute, and the Ingenuity drone, which by the way contains a piece of the original Wright Flyer within it. So speaking of heritage and space flight, but JPL sent the drone to document this site because they wanted to do an engineering autopsy. But in fact, what they've also done is document this as a heritage site, so that if and when people or robots go back to this site at a later date, we can actually understand the processes that are affecting this human-made material on Mars over time. Back on Earth, there's certainly material that we can look at that consists of space archaeology. So for example, the so-called spacecraft graveyard in the South Pacific Ocean, where most of the items from low Earth orbit are sent to a watery grave after their missions are ended. This is the area that's targeted for safety purposes, at least to avoid hitting humans. It's the most remote part of Earth from inhabited land. And so there's lots of material that's at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean that we could go and look for. And we can also look at sites on land. So for example, on the left, we've got the Apollo 1 launch pad 34, which I know is going to be the subject of the next talk coming up in this conference, with a view to the rest of Cape Canaveral Space Force Base in the background. Or, for example, the Arecibo Observatory radio telescope, which collapsed in December of 2020. These also are equally valid sites for archaeological investigation. Okay, so what about our project, the International Space Station Archaeological Project? Well, the way that this started was I had already been interested in the issues of creating an archaeological project studying human activity in space in 2008, when a graduate student in a seminar I was teaching raised her hand and said, "What about stuff in space? Is that heritage?" And kind of like the light bulb went on for me at that moment. I thought, I've never thought about this before, but yes, that's definitely true. You know, it's if you think about a site like Tranquility Base, for example. But space archaeology has really seemed to be a kind of theoretical pursuit rather than a practical one, because generally speaking, archaeologists need to go to the site that they're working on, like my site in Spain. I have to go there and I have to not only be digging it, but I need to be observing it and strategizing in the time period that I'm doing the digging, reacting to what we're finding and changing our methods as necessary. And since we can't go to space, archaeologists, that seemed pretty impossible. But I happened to be following NASA in late 2015 on Twitter, and I noticed that they were advertising for new astronaut candidates, as they do from time to time. And I took a closer look at the advertisement that they put out, and you're seeing kind of the pamphlet on the left. And this was part of the text of that pamphlet, which said essentially, just before the passage that you see here, that if you have a degree at any level, bachelor's through PhD, in science or technology, engineering, those are qualifying degrees. But then, as it says in this passage, the following degree fields, while related to the engineering and the sciences, are not considered qualifying. You can skip down to the highlighted part, including degrees in social sciences, open parenthesis, geography, comma, anthropology, comma, archaeology, etc., close parenthesis. And I was kind of shocked by this. It seemed to me that really, first of all, surprising that they were thinking enough about archaeology to include us in this list. Like, why were we even on their radar? But on the other hand, thinking a little bit more deeply about it, why were they so sure that they didn't want people in the social sciences so much as to actually prohibit us from applying? Because, you know, it's clear that there has been decades of physiological and psychological research on the effects of spaceflight on humans and the risks associated with that spaceflight. But also, at the same time, there's been almost no study of the social and cultural components of human spaceflight. And if you want to put people in space for long periods of time, let's say you want to send them on a 3-year round trip mission to Mars, that seems like a really important issue that you should want to consider in order to optimize your mission for success. So I thought it was a little bit silly. And I mean, I can also say, I actually think archaeologists might make good astronauts. We're used to going far away and living in bad conditions and living with people that we speak different languages from. And we're used to fixing equipment that breaks down all the time and doing so with whatever we have available. On some level, I think we actually might thrive in this environment, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. Anyway, so I took this as a kind of a challenge. How could I show the space agencies? And by the way, NASA's not alone in this policy. All of the space agencies, except for the Japanese Space Agency in its current recruitment, have had the exact same rules. So there's never been a social scientist astronaut up until now. But how could I show them what they were missing out on, what they needed to learn? How could I show them, in essence, that they didn't even know yet what they didn't know? Well, I started to think about the International Space Station, and inspired by some work that other colleagues had done in the field of contemporary archaeology, realized that they had actually been documenting the material culture of the space station for us without even realizing it. So what they had been doing is they've been taking photographs for the entire time that the space station has been inhabited. You may know that the space station has been continuously inhabited since November 2nd of 2000. So now we're 22 and a half almost years of at least 2 people being on the space station. And not only that, but because it was in 2000, at the moment that digital camera technology was on the rise, becoming widely adopted, there are many, many, many more photos of the inside of ISS and what's been happening there than there are of any other previous space missions, which were always limited in the number of photos that existed by the number of film canisters that the crew could bring along with them. So here you're actually seeing some representative images from the moment when I started to think about this in November 2015, to give you a sense of what some of that photography looks like. I'll give you some more examples in a second. But the idea basically is if we can document who's in what photos, where they're located in the space station, and what objects, what things they're associated with in those photos, not only could we build a significant kind of data set about what was going on, the photos, because they're digital, also have metadata encoded in them, of course, the date and time that they were made. So we could put all of that information in order and start to trace out from beginning to present the kind of complete arc of behaviors and associations going on the space station. So that's what we started to do. I reached out to Alice Gorman, as I said, who's at Flinders University in South Australia, and the 2 of us started our collaboration to work on this problem. So that's really the beginning of the International Space Station Archaeological Project. What this is, well, we're inspired by a statement in a 1972 National Academy of Sciences report called Human Factors in Long Duration Spaceflight. And all the way back then, more than 50 years ago now, the authors referred to a spacecraft as, quote, a micro society in a mini world, which perfectly kind of encapsulates what interests us about spaceflight. How can we understand and characterize that micro society living in this mini world? We are the first full-scale archaeological investigation of a human habitation site in space. So we're not just collecting data about what's going on ISS, we're also interpreting it through the lens of archaeology and anthropology. And we use the material culture of ISS as our primary evidence for understanding the station's society. Our goals and our questions are the following. First of all, how do humans adapt to long-duration spaceflight and this particular environment that is completely different from the one that we are evolutionarily adapted for, an environment characterized by isolation, confinement, and microgravity? What is the relationship between designs of space technology and architecture and their actual usage? So on the one hand, you have industrial engineers and architects who are planning for a space station and trying to figure out how is this going to be used? What do we want to happen here? And then you have the way the crew actually uses it, which may be exactly what's intended, but may also be quite different from what's intended in a particular location, as we'll see in just a moment. And then finally, we're interested in understanding and demonstrating how social science perspectives and methods can contribute to improving life in space. And I think we're pretty proud, actually, of the idea that this, as strange perhaps as on the face of it as this project might sound, as an archaeological study, we're really proud of the idea that we're revealing insights that other people haven't been able to yet, and that those insights can actually be utilized by present and future space station or space habitat designers and mission planners to make life happier, healthier, and more productive for their crew. Okay, so as I mentioned, our interest started with the photography that had been produced by the crew over time. And I'm just going to show you various examples to kind of give you a sense of what this consists of. There are, in fact, something close to 10,000 photos of life inside the space station that NASA has published, NASA Public Affairs has published to its Flickr page. So if you're interested in that, I recommend you check that out. Here are some of the kinds of things that you'll see there. So different aspects of life like exercise on the left, or photography of Earth, or just out the window in general. Science work maintenance work. Also, for example, on the right side, we're seeing some CubeSats that are being loaded into the Japanese airlock to be launched. Eating and drinking, these are crucial social moments in human lives. This is something that's very poorly understood, exactly how people relate to each other in the space environment with food, and that's something that we're really examining. And I'll just point out the image on the right side here, where we have the Italian astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti. This is from her first mission, where she's drinking espresso that was made in this machine that's right beside her, a 100,000 euro espresso maker designed by the Italian Space Agency together with the company Lavazza, to produce actual espresso coffee as opposed to just kind of generic coffee. And the entire idea behind that and why it was worth that money and the launch and all of the developing the technology is as a purposeful expression of Italian culture, of what it means to be Italian in the eyes of the Italian Space Agency and its crew. And so that became a priority. That's a really interesting phenomenon, doing something for specifically cultural reasons, not necessarily to develop, at the exploration of space in any particular way. We can also look, for example, at what evidence there is from photographs of sleep and rest, right? So on the left, we have a cosmonaut's crew berth and the way that he has decorated it. On the right, we have a US astronaut's crew berth and the way that she has decorated it. And in the middle, we actually have a US astronaut who, like many astronauts who have visited the space station, did not get a crew berth because there typically have not been enough of them for all of the crew on board. So he's sleeping in the airlock. And what is that experience like? What is that in the sense of, not having any privacy? Privacy is something we tend to take for granted here on Earth, right? So being the one person who doesn't have their own berth, what does that do to that person's experience of their time on board? Okay, so let's take a look at a kind of a small scale study of the photographs and what that can tell us from an archaeological perspective. So before I kind of get into it, I want to just show to you the kind of geography of the station if you're not aware of it. In this, we're looking at the station from below, so Earth would be directly behind us, and the front of the space station is at the top of the image. The aft, of the station is at the bottom. And we have at the front the US orbital segment and at the back the Russian segment. And we're going to be looking at this module right here, the one at the very aft, known as Zvezda, or the service module. This is the interior of it. So this is a Russian module, very typical in its design, where it's using this kind of beige fabric for the walls, differently from the US modules, which tend to have hard white and blue plastic for the wall coverings. Notably here in this image, we have no Russians. There is an American, a Japanese crew member, and a Hungarian-American space tourist in this image. So in this Russian facility, we get a sense of internationalness. But I think the thing that's maybe most striking is not the three people who are in this image, but all of the things that are visible in this image. This is really a rich cultural landscape, computers, cameras, etc. And it's possible to identify all of them. So we have things like portraits of Russian space heroes, toys, food here on the table, icons, Orthodox icons. There's one behind Charles Simonyi's head here. There's two more here and one more located here over a crew berth. There's one crew berth located here, one located here. There's a painting of the most famous church in Russia right here. There are mission patches and a flag. So all kinds of items. When I saw this photo, which is actually from 2009, I started to think, is that stuff always there? Is that what this is normally like? And so I was looking particularly at the images of this location over time, and hopefully you can see as we look at it, whether it's in the niche, what I call the niche, this area kind of tucked away below, or in what I call the top area just above that, which hopefully we'll see in one of these images. This is in chronological order. So here, the top area between the two vents, that this display has constantly been changing. There have been different items being put up there over time, the whole time, starting from the very first mission. And I know everybody loves graphs, but this is actually kind of cool. We were able to track the number of items on display, and we can see that they don't go from 0 to actually 78 total items in 14 years. They don't go from 0 to 78, but they go up and down and up and down and up again, showing that different crews had different ideas about what they wanted to put in that area. And additionally, we could take a look at the breakdown between the religious items, which are in red, and the secular items in blue, so that in this period around 2002, when there are quite a few items on display, relatively few of them are religious in nature, but from 2005 onwards, we see a distinct growth in the number and proportion of religious items. Even when there are a lot of items here, there are actually a lot of religious items as part of that. In fact, we can tie these this growth and display probably to particular items, particular events that are going on Earth, specifically the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II in 2005, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, and the buildup to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This gives you a kind of a sense. I don't want to linger too long on this, also because I don't have a huge amount of time, but you get a sense that there really were patterns of display in this area. The number one item that was seen in this location was this image of Yuri Gagarin, really remarkable that he's seen so often here. In fact, this particular image appeared in the second expedition on board the space station and appeared on the wall in the fifth expedition in 2002. And since that first appearance on the wall, 21 years ago, almost 21 years ago, it has been on the wall the entire time. So it has consistently been located on that wall, and it shows Gagarin's importance as a kind of secular saint or hero for the cosmonauts. And I just want to also note that this location for the display of items, there are no fasteners or hooks. There's nothing that says that this is a space that should be used for the display of items. And additionally, it's just a place that the crew has kind of opportunistically taken over for that. But they didn't just take it over for that in ISS. We actually, and I don't really have enough time to show you at the moment, we can trace this tradition of cosmonauts back not only to the Mir station, which is basically architecturally identical to the Zvezdan module. This was happening in the exact same location on the Mir station, and indeed even in some of the later Salyut stations. And the idea of putting images up on the wall for display shows up as early as 1976 in the Salyut 5 station. So it's really an interesting phenomenon. Here, I'm just going to show you quickly an interesting aspect of what's gone on recently. This is from Yusaku Maezawa's tourist visit in December 2021. And I want to focus on this icon that was placed over the crew berth door of the then commander Anton Shkaplerov. My colleague Wendy Salmond at Chapman, who is a specialist in Russian icon studies, was able to identify the figure as Saint Fedor Ushakov. Ushakov lived in the 18th century and was the founder of the Russian naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea. And he was canonized in 2001 and made the patron saint of the Russian Navy and of the Russian Air Force's nuclear bombing forces. This icon actually shows him in front of the Sevastopol naval base. So this is a really striking choice to put this particular icon up over Shkaplerov's door. All the more so because Shkaplerov himself is actually from Sevastopol. So in December of 2021, he was making a clear statement about his piety and about his support for the Russian annexation of Crimea in this very interesting location on the space station, and in a way that would have been legible to Russians and his fellow Russian crew, but probably not at all to the other crew on board or to the other space agencies involved in the ISS project. So this is how we were able to kind of make the significance of an archaeological approach to documenting these objects really apparent. Okay, very quickly, I also just want to talk about another way we've used the photos. The Flickr photos include other kinds of metadata besides time and date. In particular, they're all captioned by NASA Public Affairs. So an image like this will have a caption that says something like, Drew Morgan and Jessica Mayer work in the waste and hygiene compartment in the Tranquility module. And we were able to scrape the data of those captions for about 6,300 of them that say both the name of the individuals pictured and where they're located on the space station. So for an image like this, we'd be able to say, oh, we have one male US astronaut, US NASA astronaut, and one female NASA astronaut, US astronaut, and they're located in Tranquility, or what's also known as Node 3. And we were able to take all of that data and then plot out for the first time the distribution of different categories of people across a space station. This is not something that any of the space agencies have even tried to do. I think they would find developing the data a little bit challenging, or even figuring out what kind of data might serve that purpose, challenging. What we're looking at here is the actual population, female and male of ISS, so 16% female, 84% male, and then the distribution across the various modules of ISS of those two categories, with the US segment here, kind of in order from front to aft. And then these are the Russian modules. And you note the Russian modules have very low proportions of women compared to the actual proportion, which is not so surprising if you keep in mind that they have only just sent their second female cosmonaut to ISS in the last few months, in 22 years. But this is also true actually of the US side. In the photographs, we tend to see women less frequently in the European lab, in Node 2, where the sleeping quarters are, in Node 1, where eating happens, and in Node 3, which is hygiene and exercise. And so that's really interesting that we don't see women represented very frequently in those areas. But then look at the cupola, where in fact they are 24% of the population that's seen there. In other words, 50% higher than we would expect based on their actual proportion of the population. It seems that the NASA Public Affairs Office has a penchant for publishing images of women in particular in an aesthetically appealing location like the cupola. Now, that indicates a probable bias in this particular data set, and there are ways that we would like to kind of rectify that bias, but I'll just show one way in which the images definitely still can be used to understand these populations. So here we're looking by nationality. Again, the bottom bar shows the actual proportion, with this red color is the US, the blue color is Russia, and then other groups. And of course, in the Russian side, the Russians dominate, the blue colors here, and on the US side, the US tends to dominate. But at the same time, this color right here represents Japan in the Japanese module, and this color here represents Italians alone in the European module. So in other words, what this indicates is the extent to which we have nationalized spaces in what we otherwise consider to be a so-called international space station. And it raises questions about how the work and life is managed on the space station by these various space agencies, and the question of whether it's actually being managed in an optimal way so that all people are working kind of all across the space station. It's a key question when we're talking about a space habitat that has cost over $150 billion to build and maintain, and an additional $3 or $4 billion every year just for NASA alone. That's a lot of money, and we should be asking whether this is being used very effectively. Okay, I'm going to close by talking about a different approach that we've taken to understanding life on the space station. And in particular, we came up with a variety of different ideas for experiments that we would like the crew, to carry out on our behalf, from everything from doing video recordings, sampling the air for cultural materials, sampling surfaces, doing audio recordings to understand, for example, how far away you have to be from someone else to have a private conversation. We take privacy very seriously in our daily lives on Earth. And if you can't have that in a space habitat, your life is going to be compromised in some way. The RFID placement, that's an idea for how we can get more data about what spaces people are using, put RFID tags on the crew and monitor as they're crossing various thresholds. But we actually were able to carry out an experiment on ISS last year with the sponsorship of the ISS National Lab, which has an allocation of half of the crew's time to devote to research. And basically what we did, we created what we call the Sampling Quadrangle Assemblages Research Experiment. Everything has to have an acronym, as you're probably aware in space. And we were basically adapting one of the most basic archaeological techniques for sampling a site, which is what we call the shovel test pit. So the idea is if you don't know what you're going to find at a site, you can lay out a grid of squares on it and dig 1 by 1 meter squares within that in different places to give you a sense of the whole. This is very quick and easy, and it's something that we teach introductory archaeology students all the time. And we actually took this idea and kind of adapted it for space archaeology. So the idea was to designate 1 meter squares in different modules of the space station and to have them be photographed at the same time every day for 30 days by the crew, and then at a random time each day for 30 days because we didn't know what kind of results we would get. And we're mapping and analyzing the movement of items within each square over time. This happened between January and March of last year. We're currently going through the photographs and documenting what we're finding in those photographs, which I'll show you in just a second. But in any case, this is the very first systematic study of in situ material culture in a space habitat. And what's crucial about it is that unlike the historic photographs, which we were using, for example, in the Zvezda study, those were taken at essentially randomly for our purposes. They weren't taken with our needs or our questions in mind. They were not systematic in any way, not in the way that they were taken and not in the way that they were published. So the point of this was to do a scientific version of photographic documentation that would allow us to study the space station kind of by proxy, which is the best way we can do it since, as we know, we're not allowed to go there. So this is the basic idea, to pick an area, for example, like the galley in the US Node 1 module, and to photograph it over time, just what's within a 1 meter square. And this is our one giant leap moment. Alice and I were watching live on Teams video conference, and this is astronaut Kayla Barron on January 14th, 2022. And this is the first time that anything archaeological has ever been done in space. I can't even tell you how cool it was to see the first time something was being done in your discipline in space. And what she's doing is she's placing a yellow piece of adhesive tape, what's called CHAPMAN tape, to mark the upper right corner of one of our squares, in this case in the Japanese module, known as Kibo. So she has, you can see she's got the Ziploc bag Velcroed to her leg with the tools that she needs in it, a ruler and measuring tape and stuff like that. On her other leg, she has an iPad strapped to it with the drawing showing where the tape is supposed to go. This is it. This is like our Neil Armstrong. It's so cool. I can't even. Anyway, so yeah, so she's putting this piece of tape up there. And here she is taking a photograph of a different square, which is located in the galley. So you can see one of the corners of the tape. So this is the square. You'll see an image of it momentarily. And this gives you a sense, so you can see the yellow tape here and here. We couldn't have a whole string of tape for the whole meter. So we just marked the corners. We didn't want to block anything off. So here and here, and then I've added in the yellow dotted lines. And so what we're doing is we are cataloging every single item that is in every photograph, not only what it is, but also its location, so that we can tell how items are moving around within the space or moving in and out of the space. And here's a typical example of one of these images where we have a portable glove bag that's being held in place by a carabiner attached to a bungee cord, and there's all kinds of other things going on. So clearly there's preparation for some sort of experiment going on here. This just shows you how we draw bounding boxes around the different items to mark their location. And then we actually type the information about them. Oh, this is a binder clip. This is a digital timer. This is a cargo transfer bag. This is a bungee cord. This is a carabiner. Everything is captured from the 358 images that we have. And just to give you a sense of how this looks over time, this is the same location, different day, right? And here it's being used for an experiment on concrete and how concrete sets, and it's being monitored from Earth using this light, this LED light, and the video camera. The crew member is monitoring their progress on their schedule. They have a water bottle handy so they don't have to leave and go get something to drink if they get thirsty. Or here we have the galley, as I was saying a second ago. And I'll just note that here we have a crew member who was actually in the middle of lunch, was reading an ebook on an iPad while that was going on. We have all their condiments. I will say the item that moved around most in this area was Altoids tin, which I'll be happy to talk about in the questions if you want. Another image on a different day, and we actually have a physical book. I don't think anybody had ever documented the desire of the crew to read while they're eating before, but here we have it. Or here where we have tubes of cake frosting. What's going on there? Well, it turned out, as Kayla Barron posted on her Instagram feed, we actually have the creation of a birthday cake for a colleague. She and another American astronaut made a birthday cake for their crewmate Pyotr Dubrov, the cosmonaut. Right, so that cooking and baking is a social activity. Making something for somebody like this is a way of showing how you care about them. But cooking and baking are also practically impossible in space, and even so, they're making the effort. We also looked at areas like this. This is the Kibo one. This is the piece of tape that you saw Kayla putting up on the wall, and this was an area where almost nothing changed over time. We knew that was going to be the case. The NASA folks asked us, "Are you sure you don't want to pick another spot? Because nothing really is planned to happen here." And we said, yes, we do, because archaeology isn't a treasure hunt. It's not a question of capturing the most things. What we want to see is the difference between a low activity area and a high activity area. And how would we know that difference if we didn't see it and document it? So that's what happened here. And we even got photobombed by the crew. That was kind of fun. And it showed us that they were enjoying what they were doing. This was in the Node 3 hygiene area. So we have Mark Vandehei, it was his job to take the photos that day. And Kayla, who's here, was presumably just popped her head in from exercising. The exercise equipment is directly adjacent to this location. You can also see a crew member's hygiene kit with deodorant, dental floss, toothpaste, etc., a small towel. This kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We're going through all of this data. We don't have any final results yet, but hopefully soon. This is our team. We are all around the world working on this, and it's incredibly exciting, and I'm happy to talk more in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was fantastic. And I feel like I'm, restraining myself from yelling amen over and over, because I am, as an anthropologist myself, I am for sure on your team here. Could we get you to stop sharing your screen? And then we've got a couple questions I think we'll have time for. Awesome.
Yep.
All right. So the first one from the chat: religion tends to have a heavy focus on calendars, days of the week, times of year, and places like churches. Do you have any ideas or notes about how people practice religion while in space?
Oh, that's really interesting. Dina, you're probably aware of this because this is really getting towards your particular research, right? My favorite example of this was when Sheikh Muzaffar Shakur, who was the lone Malaysian astronaut to visit ISS, before his visit, the Malaysian Space Agency actually called on a group of imams to develop a protocol for performing Islamic worship in a space context. Because of course, typical Islamic worship requires kneeling and standing up and kneeling again and bowing your head and things like this as you're performing the prayers and making hand gestures. And you can't stand up in space and you can't kneel down in space. So what do you do? And they came up with a document that was really interesting that basically said, if you are able to tilt your body, tilt your body. If you can't tilt your body, tilt your head. If you can't tilt your head, close your eyes or something like that, right? And so do the best you can. You're not able to face towards Mecca, face towards Earth. these kinds of things. So those practical issues were thought about in advance, and we're actually going to see them. We're going to have the first long duration Islamic nation representative in the UAE is sending an astronaut, and the next crew 6 mission. So that's going to be continuing. But there's a great video on YouTube showing Sheikh Muzaffar Shakur performing worship in the Russian module, which is really interesting, with the Orthodox stuff behind him, the icons and the cross behind him on the wall. So, these are some of the issues that need to be dealt with and need to be thought about when you're thinking about spaceflight and religion.
Absolutely. Thanks. And then there was one more question. It's a little long, but we've got a couple minutes. So your slides depicting the human detritus being left on other worlds, Moon, Mars, etc., raise the point that we may unintentionally be confusing the heck out of future explorers, be they from Earth or elsewhere, when they happen upon these items. How would a future archaeologist determine what was homegrown debris and what was imported? Any thoughts on this? Should we be doing anything about this in the future to mark items as from Earth?
Well, I don't think we're going to run into the problem of alien hardware anytime soon, to be honest. That's just my opinion. I do want to just point out that as of now, there's roughly 180 tons of human material on the moon. That's probably when I learned that I was shocked to understand. But there are rocket bodies as well as the lunar modules and the various probes that have been sent there, et cetera. So there's a huge amount of human material on the moon, less on Mars and on Venus and the other. But we sent stuff all over the solar system now, and in fact beyond the solar system now, right? I think that what we do need to do is think about how these sites are going to be preserved, because we don't fully yet understand how to operate. For example, in the lunar environment, there's been studies about how far does regolith travel when it's hit by rocket exhaust, and the answer is it can go into orbit. It can go for kilometers. How are you going to protect a site like Apollo 11? How are we going to just say whether anybody can even visit it? Those are issues that I think are really important. At the moment, under international law, nobody can designate any heritage in space as protected, even though actually Beth O'Leary's work led to the states of California and New Mexico designating the objects at the site as historic resources. That really doesn't have any legal force to it. So I think that that's really a crucial issue. As far as knowing whether it's human or not, I mean, I think if we actually have seen in the imagery from the Ingenuity drone as part of the Perseverance mission how far some of the items from the landing have traveled. That there have been little sparkly bits of metal that have shown up quite far away, and it's not because it's Martian stuff. It's definitely human stuff, but it's gone in places that we hadn't anticipated. So that's really important and interesting for us to understand.
I think it's going to be hard to do things like date things, though, like what was from, 1969 and what was from 2027 or something.
So this is where archaeologists work by typologies, right? So items that come from what we can call the Apollo culture are going to look quite different from things that belong to the ISS culture. So that's how we would understand that. Low Earth orbit is an interesting example of this, because there's now this generally accepted rule that something that goes up into Leo needs to be taken out of orbit within 25 years. So if everybody's adhering to that, there's going to be a gap between when that rule started and the future. And the question, like, how will we be able to understand the technological development of satellites in low Earth orbit if they're all deorbited? So actually, we need to think about which are the significant and which are the innovative missions, and can we preserve those? I know that space debris is a huge problem, but it can't just be a blanket, like we're going to get rid of everything because it's dangerous. But some things we actually might, like Hubble. The Hubble Space Telescope probably ought to be preserved if we can. That's completely changed our understanding of the universe. But at the moment, the only plan is to maybe lift it up for another 30 years, and then eventually it'll come back and eventually deorbit. I would like to see it lifted up into a much higher, more stable orbit, but that's expensive and difficult, and where's the political willpower for that?
It's true. All right. Well, I hate to have to cut you off. As you know, I could converse with you about this for a really long time,
Yeah.
and we probably will. But thank you very much for your presentation here at Roger That, and happy travels today. And next up, we've got Jamie Draper, who I see has just come into the room. And so we're going to go and give everybody a little moment for a break and catch up, start up again at 10:30. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Dina.
Justin Walsh, everybody. Thank you.